This is Create the Next from Pro CFO Partners, where every week we explore strategies and ideas for financial management and growth to help today's businesses put their financial picture in context.
Welcome back to Create the Next. I'm Chris Bentliff, and today Vaughn Henson joins us. And Vaughn, I'm looking forward to our conversation because we're talking a little bit about the role of the fractional CFO, which we've explored here in Create the Next. But I love the idea of talking more about training and the opportunities, maybe the responsibilities, maybe the unique perspective or expertise that the fractional CFO can bring into training your team, your leadership team, your organization. So welcome. And let's start with kind of what is that opportunity or how do you kind of level set this idea of, from a training perspective, what does the fractional CFO bring that is unique?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Great question. Good to be here with you on Create the Next. And my perspective on the fractional CFO training capability, in fact, I think a lot of us at Pro CFO have the same mindset, is we're no different than your full-time CFO. We happen to bill out on a fractional basis so we can right-size the financial impact and we can spread our experience across multiple companies. But all the CFOs in our firms have decades of experience. So perhaps we come at it from a little different angle than maybe someone who's come up through your organization for the last 10, 15, 20 years. So we might bring that perspective to it. But you should have the same expectations on a fractional CFO that you do a full-time CFO. And, you know, as the modern CFO comes into view, and we understand the capabilities are way beyond debits, credits, financial statements, you should have that same high expectation. Training should get involved in all kinds of areas with an eye towards impact on your people. You can actually measure an ROI on training. And if you haven't been, you know, you should be. So the fractional CFO should bring that high level of expertise, professional competence, discipline to your training, regimen throughout your whole organization. So I'd say there's really no difference in a fractional CFO and your full-time.
Do you feel like that's because I may not have been thinking about my CFO as an educator, a trainer, a person who can help me understand. Now, I've had tons of conversations with executives here, even on Create the Next, where they can't believe the things they didn't know that the fractional CFO from Pro CFO Partners has helped them to know. So is training in your mind more of an informal, casual, sort of osmotic, hang out with me long enough and you're going to learn some stuff? Or is it more of a, today, team, I want to help you develop some financial literacy about X, Y, and Z? How do we think about that? Or what's the best way, the most efficient way to think about that in our organization?
Another great question. You may think this is a little bit of a cop-out, but the answer kind of depends. I mean, there's so many different learning styles, right? There's visual, there's experience, there's listening, there's different ways that the team wants to absorb training. So the first part I should mention is the fractional CFO needs to be part of the team, right? Be with the team, be part of the team, pick up on how the team wants to learn. Then another part of the response, I think, depends on the CFO themselves. What personality traits do they bring to the table, and what really emphasizes kind of their natural style? And when you get that same symbiotic relationship between how the team wants to learn and how the CFO conducts him or herself, you can really create something pretty powerful. So, and for example, in your question, you ask, is it kind of a symbiotic? Does it just happen? Is it formal? And I'm saying it's both. It kind of depends on the training. There's certainly some technical training that might need a little formal basis, but some of the most impact I've had is just informal, seeing what someone's doing. I take a minute and just explain an example that comes to mind from a few years ago. I was watching a colleague went into his office, saw he had a spreadsheet up that looked like hundreds of lines long, ends up being 800 lines long, and he was spending days going through and adding a couple of lines under every subtotal and doing a subtotal in Excel, sort of manually. And I didn't know at the time it was taking days, but I saw this process and I just said, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm adding subtotals by customer, by margin, by some other metric, maybe by state or product group. And I just said, have you ever heard of pivot tables? He said, no, what are you talking about? I said, let me just show you. Let's just sit down and show what the power of Excel, and a feature back then was pivot tables. Now it's gone to a whole nother level with Power BI tools and AI tools. The point being, the system can do that work for you. So it literally, once he figured it out and got comfortable with it, he came back a few days later and said, "You literally saved me 3 days a month by having this feature." And I never would have known that. And if I was designing an Excel training course, I may or may not have known to include pivot tables in it. So part of it, it really is important to be there, be with the team, know what the team is struggling with, and training should, impact those struggles. So if you don't know what struggles are, the training, whether it's formal or impromptu, isn't going to be as crisp and effective as it otherwise could be and should be.
I love every syllable you are sharing right now. And I wonder if one of the first things, tell me what you are experiencing. And we've talked a lot about, even with Nelson, the role of the modern CFO. We're increasingly moving away from, thank goodness, this idea of, okay, please show us your report for the next 7 minutes and then we'll move on. We're moving away from thinking of just kind of this operational mindset. But do you feel that there's maybe one of the first opportunities for training, I'm using air quotes for our listeners, is recalibrating your expectations of the CFO, particularly if you've had the same person in that seat for the last 15, 20 years, and they're really good at this thing, but they don't go outside that thing. And so you've never thought to have expectations outside that thing. Do you feel like that's a conversation that needs to come up often as you're just getting started? Sort of our first training, everybody, is let's rethink the CFO. Or is that well in hand at this point?
No, I think it's completely being rewritten even as we speak. In terms of the tools that are now available. Earlier I mentioned pivot tables. That technology and features been around for decades. Now it's the massive amount of data crunching that we can do through an AI-based system, or Power BI comes to mind. So now it's more of a mental exercise of, okay, what should we be looking at, given that we can now look at not just dozens of metrics or KPIs, but hundreds, could be thousands, and you can slice it multiple ways. So the manual effort, and to date myself a little bit, I came into the accounting world, we were still sort of at the end of using multi-column spreadsheets and starting to use, multi-column manual ledgers and starting to use spreadsheets. And that changed the way that we could look at data instantly, and that sea change is going on now as well. So your modern CFO, your strategic CFO needs to help lead that effort. Now, to be clear, I'm not a technologist, so I may not be the one that knows how to put the data links together and dive into your table and systematically pull the information out. But I have a pretty good handle on what you should be looking at, right? What metrics we should look at to help move the needle. And then there's the human gap of being able to train the team on, in fact, some of the best training I enjoy doing is the impact of your operating decisions you're doing now. Remember, we're not operating the business in a training vacuum where we're always going back to a manual. We're having to make decisions on the fly every day. Ship that product, ship that. Do I work overtime? Do we come in? What do we do? So we need a mechanism that's focused on helping the operating team, your team, what's the impact of their decisions on those financial statements? Because the financial statements, even with all the tools we have, those still are the heartbeat of the company. It not in a cold-hearted way, but the money still matters, and that's what fuels your growth. Even if you're a nonprofit, right? Without margin, you don't have a mission. So training the team on the impact of those decisions, how it affects the numbers, is going to continue to be important. How we do it, I think we're in the middle of experiencing some changes there. The vast amount of data that we now have is beyond what we've had in the past at our fingertips. So yeah, I think the work of the modern CFO, in a sense, is I don't think it's too bold to say it's kind of just beginning. It's at another level to step it up. So you do need to be looking to your CFO to bring that kind of impact to your organization.
You make a really interesting point around this idea of, look, I'm not a technologist, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more. I don't need to be a tech expert. I don't need to be the software engineer. I don't need to be the AI genius, but I need to know how those things are becoming increasingly applicable. I need to know, is that accurate? So especially if I'm thinking about the organization that's maybe a family operation or really successful, but we've had the same leadership team in place for a long time. And my CFO, that is not that person's sweet spot. One, is this a place where a fractional can complement those skills? But two, part of what I'm hearing you say is we need to have a mindset of developing, if not skills, awareness around those things so we can bring those solutions to the table. Is that accurate? Do you feel like the CFO needs to kind of have their foot to their ear to the ground a little bit so that they know what's possible? Even if they aren't the expert to get it done, they could maybe bring the expert in because they know what needs to be done in the modern sort of way of communicating with data.
Yeah, I do. I think that's a huge part of the challenge facing, not only the challenge, but the opportunity facing today's company. You give the example, maybe a smaller company, maybe a long time, valuable, loyal employee who has managed the finances, and they may be called a CFO. They may not have that strategic mindset, and they may not be aware of what's going on in the industry, or they may know their industry, but they may not know a larger context. And that is no fault of theirs. It's no, they're still a valued employee, but that is a great area where a fractional CFO can come in, because we're seeing, how multiple companies are reacting to this AIC change, for example. We're seeing how other people are solving it. And so I do believe the mantra, while AI and the new ability to crunch numbers, it may not replace your job. It may not replace an accountant's job. We still need to get the documents, make the entries. But companies that harness that power are going to outcompete your company. So you need to understand the impact and take advantage of it. In fact, the word I would use is exploit the technology. And it's not a bad word. It's exploit it. It's here. In the same way that no company is still using, an 18-column green bar ledger to record their financial results. Right? We're all using technology. This is just a new step. So bringing in a fractional CFO to make sure you're in a good place, or even help you get to a higher level of analysis is a great idea. And that may or may not be. That may be a midterm. Your team may eventually be at a place where you don't need the fractional CFO for a period. So it gives you all that flexibility. But I think that's a great reason to explore bringing in a CFO in today's world, perhaps, more than ever, or at least in the last 10 years now, probably is the best timing to bring in and take a look. Because it goes back to the old adage that we all hear and know, but you don't know what you don't know.
No, it's funny you mentioned that, because that has been resonating with me with your colleague who just didn't know about pivot tables. Sometimes we come in with a bias on what we know without an appreciation that somebody doesn't know that thing that for you might be very elementary, but they don't know it. And for you to share it could literally change their lives. It could save them days a week or weeks a month in this kind of hardship. And I think that brings me back to this idea of training. We've kind of touched on a lot of things. Is it important to have a strategic sense for training, like we do with other things, like we want to do with other things in the organization? Like, I don't know, should my CFO be involved in trying to understand these are opportunities where if we knew a little bit more, maybe it's a how-to, like a technology thing, or maybe it's just a conceptual thing. If we knew a little bit more, everybody, we could get here faster, or our competitive edge could sharpen in this way. Is this bring us back to kind of this idea of what are the KPIs of our training, as you mentioned at the outset, and how do we strategically start to build a framework for that, even culturally? How do we become an organization that is culturally ready to learn all the time? How does that kind of work in your mind?
Yeah, I think again, a CFO you usually have the temperament of measurement, training, comparing against, forecasting, et cetera. Most CFOs kind of have that mindset to begin with. And I would argue your training investment should be no different. Even, for example, if it's safety related. So in some of my previous roles, I've had safety report to me in HR, and we would spend a lot of time training on safety practices measuring near misses, measuring incidences, breaking down the incidents into multiple different types, and discussing it in an open fashion, not to embarrass somebody, but just to point out. One of the roles I had was managing a large warehouse and processing area. So we had a lot of fork trucks, and inevitably you have near misses. We weren't trying to embarrass anybody, but we would note, hey, we have a lot of near misses in between these two buildings going through this door. Let's attack that, right? So we put in mirrors, we put in a little stop sign, we put in policies of honking the fork trucks. We put blue lights on the fork trucks that show a zone. So if you're walking, you can see the light. All the little things that you did as a result of training and understanding the safety metrics. Now, in that example, the other thing that rings clear, and sometimes people don't necessarily like to look at this, but safety also pays from a financial standpoint. Obviously, the goal is keep your team safe. You want them going home to their families. That's obviously number one. But when you understand that you're implementing a safe culture and you're going out and bringing in your worker comp analyst or your insurance team, and they see that culture and they see the result of it, and over time, right, there's this thing called worker comp modification or modifier. So you're compared to every other company in your industry. And if your modifier is below 1, you actually have a savings to everyone else's premium. So if it's at a 0.8, for example, you're saving 20% on the premium versus what it would have been if it's a 1. If it's a 1.2, you're paying 20% more. So it's a great example where training and metrics actually has a dollar quantifiable ROI, because that worker comp modifier will affect your premiums for the next 3 years. So not only do you want your people to be safe, but it affects dollars. And so that's just one small example of how knowing the numbers, reporting the numbers, understanding the numbers, trying to impact the numbers, even in a traditionally non-financial area like safety, I would look towards your CFO, especially a modern strategic CFO. Hey, we need to impact our people, our culture, our numbers. Really, there's almost no limits. Now, in my case, as I mentioned, I'm not a technologist, so I'm probably not the one to offer training for software and how you're coding and the way tables should be linked. But I understand how those processes should affect the numbers by providing data. So I'm not saying the CFO is the end all be all to all training, but it's a pretty broad landscape where we can bring value.
I love your say. It's actually I think there's kind of an analogy there, a metaphor there, for when we're not literally physically examining the distance between and the near miss that occurred. And if we put a mirror here, we can take that metaphorically and apply it to, look, if we review what happened in the last 2 quarters, we can see that we could have experienced this, good or bad, or with this little nudge, this thing could have happened. So therefore, let us put this framework of these practices or this kind of scaffolding in place to either do more of that or avoid that or whatever. And that's a value of the vast sort of breadth and depth of experience that you're talking about right now, where if I'm sitting in the same chair in the same organization for 15, 20 years, I simply don't have those experiences to bring into contextual awareness kind of what's possible. I do want to really open doors for thinking there.
I want to jump in with one more, maybe more traditional example. You would think of a CFO, and you still want to have that expectation. So I'm not trying to get into every area, but for example, in the past, I've done a lot of training on financial literacy and the impact of everyday decisions, how they impact your financial statements. And there's a variety of ways to do it. But one of an example is a team I was leading on their own because we mentioned, our supplies, how that impacts our bottom line, and the higher we spend on supplies that we don't need to, and the waste, that's taking 100% impact out of our margin if we're spending money we don't need to. They noticed that we were throwing away in some cases, and in some cases throwing them back to the supplier, a lot of pallets, logistics pallets that you put product on that we could have reused. Now, there's a little safety element in there that you want your pallets to be in good shape and in good order because you're putting heavy weights on them. So we train them on, how to review a pallet. But they came up with, and we developed a stacking area where they could put the good pallets that we could reuse. Back in those days, and now, of course, the expenses have gone up even more. But back in those days, a good oak pallet was $8 of the dimension we wanted, a standard 4x4. So we saved $8 a pallet, literally. And when you looked at our volume, which went from 300,000 pieces a year to over 3 million in about a 3-year period, just saving those pallets was a $100,000 a year impact straight to the bottom line, which then we can have a little fun saying that was 100%. The incremental margin on that was 100%. If you save $1, you make $1. So saving 100,000 at a 10% margin is like getting a new customer for $1 million in revenue. Right. So we don't try to get overly complicated in math, but it gave them the feeling that, wow, that was like getting another $1 million customer, which at that time would have been, probably a 6th or 7th largest customer that we would have had. So it's the team driving the fork trucks and noticing supplies being used. We're responsible for adding to the impact of having, another top 10 customer. So just one example, just a great example of how a simple process, awareness of decisions, and caring for being on the floor, knowing the team, being part of the team. Your CFO should be bringing that level of training to it, because they've, at least in my case and many others, we've been in multiple different businesses and areas and warehouses. We're no smarter than anyone else. I've already admitted I'm not a technology guy, so I struggle with even how to do a Zoom meeting. I have to think about it, but I've just seen a lot. And so the key is really getting that knowledge applied in the right way where the team can absorb it, again, so you can have a bottom line, an ROI on training. And that's, as I've said, that's absolutely my expectation, is that it should make an impact.
Vaughn Henson is a genius from Pro CFO Partners. And I think you're a little bit, I don't know, when you say you're not smarter than anybody else, I'm gonna raise my hand and say, well, you might be smarter than me, but I appreciate all of your expertise, and especially your experience and your novel way of sort of rethinking how we can be wrapping that into the mindset of learning and training. So valuable. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm looking forward to having you back, and we can talk about more aspects of how the modern fractional strategic CFO can really inject some new ways of thinking and doing inside of an organization. I appreciate that. Thanks, Vaughn.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It was my pleasure to be a part of it. And I appreciate the questions helping us kind of probe and define where we need to go, because we need to be part of this business revolution that's going on. So great conversation. Enjoyed it. Look forward to having another session with you soon.
Great. Take care.
Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Visit ProCFOPartners.com for more strategies and ideas for financial management and growth to help you put your business's financial picture in context.